Welcome all of you. So happy to have you here. Thank you very much to Blackstone Library. This is Jenna, who coordinates all this, and of course, to our distinguished speaker, Mr. Dennis Culliton. A few notes before we start. First off, we have our annual meeting, if you remember, the Branford Historical Society, the 16th, next week. And that's really interesting. This isn't, it's not for that, the topic will not be one specific item, a piece of American history. That'll be two really exciting groups. A lot of contrast. One is the Branford Electric Railway Association, known as the Shoreline Trolley Museum. They've been around for decades and decades. And they have a lot of new exciting programs, and they also have a lot of renovations doing. They're inviting everybody to come by and look. And the other one, I don't know if people here have even heard of it, is the Stony Creek Museum. Almost brand new. Just started up, they're really excited about it. They've got lots of great history to focus on right down there in the village of Stony Creek. So we'll have guest speakers from both. And if you sign up for membership, you'll get an invitation to attend that. Membership is really nominal, it's $20. They don't make you sign a work party oath or anything like that. But we look forward to having all of you become members and attend the annual meeting. Those two exciting topics. Oh, one thing, if you have a cell phone, can you please put it on mute if you haven't already? Let's see, the holiday party December 5th, and that's all I have to say. I want to keep my remarks brief. I'll introduce now Mike Russo, our programs chair, who sets up all of these great programs for us and has everybody in. And let me just say finally, it's so nice to be back out in public, even with masks on. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much, everyone.
Yeah, those were my thoughts. It was great to see everybody live in person. And we waited a long time for a in-person presentation. So I want to just introduce Dennis. It says here, Dennis Culliton is the founder and executive director of the Witness Stones Project. He served in the Marine Corps before attending college at UMass, receiving degrees in both anthropology and economics. After a decade working for the federal government, he went on to Quinnipiac University, graduating with an MAT in history. While in his third decade of teaching, he started the Witness Stones Project with his students in Guilford. To date, the project has spread to over a dozen communities in 3 northeastern states, reaching more than 4,000 students. And besides this project, Dennis is devoted to his wife of 43 years, his 3 adult children, and his grandchildren, Frankie and Joey. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dennis Culliton.
Thank you, Michael. And my first job out of college was at a little factory named Electric Boat. I worked on a government-sized soup ship, Groton. So that was my first job out of college. I was a contract negotiator there. So we've traveled the same roads, at least part of our lives. So what I'm gonna do is, for the sake of the recording, I'm gonna just present through Zoom. If I can find it again. Okay, there it goes. So I'm used to using a bigger screen. Let me see if I can get rid of myself on the corner there. Okay, I'm used to using a bigger screen, so I apologize. It will be available online. So if you want to go home and look at a bigger version of it, please do. And I do a lot of talking, so you can kind of fill in the blanks. But so I was asked to talk about slavery on the shoreline and in Connecticut. That's where we do most of our work, and we're very excited to start the project. So I started in 2017 after my friend Nygren from Guilford went to, after hearing me speak at the Guilford Free Library about slavery in Guilford and Madison, he went to Germany and learned about the Stolpersteine Project there and came back and asked, could we remember enslaved people the way Jews are remembered, where they lived freely before they were kidnapped and murdered during the Holocaust. So I always say, if you bring a sore knee to a doctor, they're going to want to operate, or a surgeon. If you bring an idea to a teacher, they're going to want to make it an educational unit. So that's what is the founding of the Witness Stones Project. Okay, I don't know if you've seen these before, but we're going to do a land acknowledgement. So it's Branford stands on the Tucket Band of Quinnipiac tribal land. I'd like to acknowledge our neighboring indigenous nations, then the Hanticks and Hammonasses to the east, the Wangunks to the north, Wappinger and Pegusses to the west, and Korjog and Setauket to the south. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibility according to their example. With the work that we do, I think the most common question we get after someone hears is, what about the indigenous people? What about indigenous or Indian slavery? And we are planning on, I wouldn't say we're planning, but we're hoping to be able to do some interpreting around that. But we go to where people ask us to go, and we tell stories that communities ask us to tell. So as we go, especially in the eastern part of Connecticut, there's a lot more stories that involve indigenous slavery. It was different. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but we know in places like Branford and Guilford early on, especially after the Pequot Wars, and then again after the King Philip Wars, indigenous people were put in servitude and sometimes even traded for African slaves in the West Indies. So one of the things that we're beginning to tell in history class is that and I use a little bit of my high school French, our raison d'etre, our reason to be is for here has a lot to do with slavery. The places like Branford and Guilford and all the towns that you see these beautiful big houses are here, not because people sold hay to each other, and not even because they sold hay to New Haven. They were here because they were putting things on vessels and sending it to the West Indies. And by sending it to the West Indies, they were trading with some of the most violent enslavers in the New World. So they were trading with sugar plantations, and they were sending barrel staves in hoops, and they were turned into barrels to put molasses and sugar in. We were sending horses, tens of thousands of horses went from Connecticut. And if you look at lists, which we'll do here soon, you'll see people filled vessels here and sent them to the West Indies and traded for the products of the slave plantations in the West Indies. So that's a lot to do with why we're here, and it's important for us to, I don't know what the right word is, remember that. The people here 250 years ago knew where the ships were going to and who they were trading with. But if you look at a lot of interpretations that we have here now, or that came in the last, it talks about the West Indies trades. We brag on our ship's captains, but we don't always say what they were doing for a living. We can see if we look closely that we know ships left from, especially Rhode Island and Connecticut and New York, and went to Africa and purchased enslaved people, but also vessels went back and forth to the West Indies. And I would say the majority of things that happened from Connecticut shoreline was this trade back and forth to the West Indies, where we sent fish, livestock, flour, and lumber in trading for slaves, sugar, and molasses, and spices, and other things like that. So it's important for us to realize that. It's important for us to kind of reset what we remember or how we tell our stories of our past. I have some specific details about concerning the prevalence of West Indian trade in colonial Connecticut economy prior to the American Revolution. This is something that I work now with Dr. Warschauer up at Central Connecticut State University, and when he was giving this presentation, I said, I'm going to steal some slides from you. So I redid the slides, so they're not exactly his, but this is from Dr. Eric Bartholomew, 2009, and he had the Inspector General's Customs Report just for this 4-year period. And we can see 3 out of every 4 horses to the West Indies came from Connecticut, an average of 31 horses on each vessel. The horses were 59% of all valued goods. They worked in the mill. They ran. Think of there was horsepower. The horses were the power to run the sugar mills that squeezed the juice out of the sugar cane and made and took the liquid, which was turned to molasses and sugar. 27,000 sheep during that 4-year period. 4.5 million pounds of beef and pork, and we know beef was set on the hook and sometimes in the barrel. And we know that we preserve things with salt. So we have the hams, salt pork, salted beef was barreled and sent to the West Indies, but also we see oxen and other livestock sent on the hoof. Other products, 44,000 pounds of butter. Butter is a way of preserving milk, right? Butter doesn't spoil hardly, especially in the hold of a ship. Cheese, 12,500 pounds, 77, almost 75,000 pounds of tallow. That's that rendered beef fat that's solid that you can make candles, you can use for lubricants and things like that. So these are things that are leaving Connecticut. We can see thousands and thousands of barrel staves, and occasionally a whole house will be taken apart and put on a ship and sent to the West Indies. So we see that type of items going on too. What was coming in from the West Indies? 1.5 million pounds of brown sugar, over 500,000 gallons of molasses, some rum was made there, but a lot of rum was made in Connecticut and Newport and places here. Rum was something that was used to trade with Africa. And also you couldn't run a ship without rum. We'll say it was a lubricant for the crew instead of the ship itself. But you can see on ships' manifests that they always had enough rum for the crew for the voyage. 450,000 bushels of salt. We know Long Island Sound isn't a great place to make salt. There were salt works, we know in New Haven. I'm not sure if there were in Branford, but it takes a lot more water from Long Island Sound to make salt than it does from the West Indies. And all you need is a mouthful of water when you go out to Squamicut and realize how much saltier it is than our Long Island Sound. 47% of all ships that came to New Haven during that time period came from the West Indies. 54% of all tonnage, 54% of all tonnage. So if you say, what were we doing for a living? Most of what we were doing was trading with the West Indies. New London, the numbers are similar, less percentage of ships, because New London also had that shot. You're kind of on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. So some of those ships we know went to Europe and to what they call the wine islands like Madeiros and places like that. But again, 46% of all tonnage into New London came from there. And those were the two main ports in Connecticut that had a customs house, had customs houses. So these are numbers for us to kind of think about when we think about Connecticut and what we were doing in the 1700s and early 1800s. There's some great books about this. The book Complicity, if you haven't read it yet, it's fantastic. It was written about 15 years ago, I think now, by three writers from the Hartford Courant. It started with an insert to the Hartford Courant, and it turned into this great book that only now I think we're beginning to unpack more. I use it with my teacher workshops, and people are like, I didn't know this stuff. It's like, well, it's here, it's out there. I picked up this book when I was on the eastern tip of Long Island, Slavery Before Race, and that's a great book by Catherine Hayes. She was a doctoral student at UMass Boston, and she looked at both the indigenous and African enslaved people at this place called Sylvester Manor, and they did archaeological digs to show that who was there, how long they were there. And Sylvester Manor was one of those places where one brother owned Shelter Island and another brother owned plantations in the West Indies, and one of them was shipping lumber and foodstuffs and things like that to the West Indies, and the other one was shipping stuff back from the West Indies. So you would have brothers kind of like multinational companies today. You might have brothers in two countries or sisters in two countries sending things to each other. In those days, that was happening. And there's a brand new book, Dark Work by Christy Clark Pajara, and she talks about Rhode Island. And Rhode Island isn't the same as Connecticut, but it helps you understand what slavery looked like in that part of New England, because I think the idea of having plantations and having large workforces and almost single crops was happening in Rhode Island. And we know if you go to Newport, Rhode Island, there's a big mansion. It's kind of up on the hill. But if you go down by the water and you see these big 3-story houses that look like Guilford on steroids or something like that, those were the ship's captains who were going to Africa. So Newport and Bristol, Rhode Island was the center of the African trade with enslaved people. So that was coming from there. And so anyway, her book does a great job of discussing those things. And there's many more books, including Disowning Slavery by Joanne Pope Mellish, which is something I always recommend for folks to read if you want to learn about New England slavery. You know, some of the things, when I got caught into this idea of looking at slavery, part of it was stumbling over the story of Harriet Beecher Stowe. So if you're from Guilford, we brag on Harriet lived in Guilford. Well, you know, maybe 2 years, but she lived in Guilford. Her mom and dad both grew up in Guilford. Lyman Beecher grew up in North Guilford, and where he was fitted out for college, for Yale. And Roxana Foote grew up in what we call Nut Plains, down kind of off of Exit 59. And these two folks lived there, and I was really excited about the connections in Guilford. At the time, I lived in the Nathaniel Johnson house, and one of his great-granddaughters married one of Harriet's brothers, and you had the Parmalee family that was kind of related to the Footes, and so all these different connections. And one day I was looking at Harriet's biography that was written by her son, and it was kind of like an autobiography. And she talks about how she liked it she was really sad when their mother died because she was living in Litchfield, but they didn't, you know, Dad didn't have any other wives. You know, he had a new wife coming, but he sent Harriet to live with Aunt Hattie and Grandma Foote. And Harriet, who had been we'll just say the youngest who wasn't an infant, because that was Henry Ward Beecher. She was the youngest in this big sprawling family in Litchfield, and she kind of got the last piece of bread from the bread basket, and she got the last piece of meat, and she was always last, and she wasn't treated well, but she loved it when she went to Guilford because there were two people, Harvey the Bound Boy and Black Dinah, and Aunt Hattie made sure they knew their place. So they had to treat her with respect because her own brothers and sisters didn't treat her with respect. And they kind of had to sit behind her, and they had to be somewhat obedient to Harriet. And I was reading that and I'm saying, who's, you know, Harvey the Bound Boy and Black Dinah? And the more I started looking, and I spoke to Joel Helander, my friend and town historian in Guilford, I said, were there slaves in Guilford? He's like, oh yeah. They're there, you know, and that's when I started looking. I started pulling strings. Later, I found out that Uncle Justin Foote, who lived in Orange County, what is now Orange County, New York, married a Dutch woman. And when he was dying of consumption or tuberculosis, he brought 2 slaves with him to Guilford, and that is Harvey and Dinah. And those were the 2 people who were living in Harriet Beecher Stowe's household. No one had ever seen that. Well, they had seen it before, but they didn't make the connection that these might be enslaved people, because Harriet's story is that she first, in a sense, stumbled upon slavery when her father got the job in Cincinnati. I think it's the name of the place, but there was an institute, a religious school there, and he got a job there. And she crossed the river into Kentucky, and then she saw slavery there. I'm like, no, she was right off of Exit 59, you know, right off of Goose Lane is where she first, you know, was involved with enslaved people. And we found other enslaved people living in the neighborhood. So this idea that this New England purity, which she kind of writes about so much, versus, you know, what was going on in the South, it was a little more muddled, the story, than before. And speaking of Harriet, her grandfather was a guy named Eli Foote. Eli Foote was a lawyer. He had to kind of make a good living, but most of the Footes were Anglican Episcopalian, and who knows what side the Anglican Episcopalians were on during the American Revolution. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, they were mostly loyalists. So Eli was a loyalist, and because of it, after the war, you know, they treated him okay, but he had to change jobs. So he became a merchant. So he was filling vessels and sending them to the West Indies. And what we can see here is that, and this is, he kind of has a consignment thing going, because he's taking stuff from other people and valuing it and going to the West Indies and selling it. And they don't go to one place. They go kind of like the old Yankee traders, right? They would go and they keep going until they sell everything, then they come home. So what I've highlighted here are 700 pounds of beef and tallow, bushels of corn and oats, 4,600 red oak barrel staves, pressed hay, which you're not sure if it was for the horses and oxen on the vessel, or if it was, they were bringing it there. An ox and then some more culling staves. One of the things you have to remember about the West Indies, they were making so much money with sugar that they didn't grow their own crops. They were making so much money with sugar that the fish that the enslaved people ate was bacalao, which is salted codfish from the Georges Bank in Canada, you know, in Massachusetts. That's why there's a codfish on top of Faneuil Hall. So they were eating codfish from the North Atlantic because they were making so much money making sugar that it didn't make sense to apply any effort towards making food items or anything else. So, and that was, and for New England, it was like, oh, we can fish, you know, we can do that and make money off of it. This is a whole item just so you can see what it looks like. This was found, I found this at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center up in Hartford. They have, the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center has lots of the Guilford foot stuff. Now we know there's Branford foots, and then we'll see a few of them here later, but the Guilford foots, including Eli Foote and his daughter Roxana Foote and her youngest brother George Augustus Foote. That was a family that lots of things happened in and around, including Hattie Ward Foote Hawley married Fighting Joe Hawley, who was a general in the American Civil War, and they were abolitionists. And so you have this interesting and amazing family, but that was again Harriet's mother's side. And these are just, and you can see this when you go, but these are just the list. So I transcribed it all, and just so you can see a few of them, you know, Simeon Chittenden's, it says, you know, so it'll be Simeon Chittenden's oxen, Thomas Griswold's oxen, Jabez Benton's ox, deducting hide and tallow, I don't know what that means, oats, and sometimes they have barrels of you know, bushel of beans, a bushel of oats, and this is some of the stuff. You know, this is rum for the sailors and rum for the guys filling the vessel, for the, you know, for the guys working on the vessel. But these are the types of things you see, and if you do look at these documents, the first column is pounds, and then it's shilling and pence. So that's the way it goes across later on. So that's still happening in 1790. They're not using dollars as a currency yet, but soon after they start using dollars as a currency. So we can see he fills the vessel and on consignment, and I think his job in life, his goal in life, is to sell things for more than what he's paying the consignment folks for. So so he's going to get the profit on the higher side of that, and also take that great risk, because it's a big risk to send the vessel down. They usually only would take 2 trips a year, starting in March, because they wanted to get back before the hurricane season. So how do we, you know, so that so getting off of that, but how do we remember the formerly enslaved here? You know, in Guilford, we just recently found the second grave marker for a man named Shem in North Guilford. In Guilford itself, the downtown graveyard was moved. So they took the stones from the green. The green was where the graveyard was. They took the stones from the green, and some of them are on Boston Street out towards Madison, and some of them are over kind of behind the Dunkin' Donuts. There's a graveyard back there on Route 1. But most of the, I'd say many of the graveyards didn't make it, but North Guilford, the graveyard still has French Indian War soldiers there, other things like that. So it's pretty extensive, but there is one gravestone. I was working with folks in Greenwich, and we see a gravestone for Candace Bush and Hester Mead. They were both enslaved by David Bush, who owned what's now the Bush Hawley House. But oftentimes we, you know, for all the hundreds and hundreds of enslaved people who lived on the shoreline here, there's very few markers or remembrance of where they were. In Guilford, the street kind of behind CBS, on some old maps was called N-word Lane. And recently someone noticed it, and the library was selling the maps, and they were like, oh, let's wipe that out before we continue selling it. And they changed it to North Street. The only thing I don't like about it is we no longer remember African Americans lived there. So if you go to Guilford, there's not an African American, there's African Americans living in Guilford, but there's not a neighborhood or a place like that. So by renaming things, sometimes we forget. It's almost, by trying to do something good by giving it a better name, we take away why it's named after a certain ethnic group. In Milford, they had a pond named Niggs Pond, and they changed it to Walker Pond. That's the name of the first African-American minister of the Baptist Church in Milford. So that's kind of a neat thing. And you guys here in Branford, you had, maybe had a different name, but you had these rocks off the coast on the maritime maps, and they just recently changed it to Soweek Rock, the name after the, I think the local sachem who was in Branford. So you can see we try to remember, but it's still hard to, balance a remembering without being, rude or inappropriate. Other less obvious places we find things, we have different documents. And I'll show you something that I found here at the library here, which is wonderful. But people are doing work. So in 1933 or 1937, Mary Hoadley Griswold, so she probably was related to Branford people too, if she's a Hoadley. She wrote stories about different houses and different people in Guilford, and she included the stories of enslaved people, which was probably, it's kind of spectacular. So that's a pretty neat book. Harry Beecher's father, his autobiography, which he often was question and answer with the kids, and he also includes letters. He talks about slavery in North Guilford. He talks about enslaved people. He even talks about Moses, who was a king of the local enslaved people. So that's a great piece of information, although we read across the grain. When he says, oh, slavery was lenient or easy in Guilford. Well, it was easy for him. I don't think it's easy for a mother whose child is sold from them. I don't think it's easy for people who are separated. I don't think it's easy when 20% of the people who were brought to the New World died on the way here. So it's never, as Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffrey says, there's no good slavery. It's worse or worse. And there's no good enslaver. It's, bad or worse. So other places we find in Greenwich, Jeffrey Mead, he went and scoured all the property records and and he found all the emancipations in the property records in the Greenwich town records, and he put it together in a book. And it's a great source. I've used it with the students in Greenwich, and I've done something similar for Guilford. I know at one time I tried to do that in Branford and I couldn't find it, and I'm not sure if it was a habit. People in some towns, one of the reasons you would put an emancipation in the property records, because you are transferring the ownership of something to somebody else, oftentimes the ownership of coal to himself. But if it's done after 1792, then there are conditions which, if you freed someone under these certain conditions, then you're not responsible for them in their old age. So people would, make sure the town clerk put it in the record so they don't have to pay if the person ended up in the almshouse. So we find that see, this is always tricky for me, but we're going to give it a try. So this is an example of, make it bigger. This is from David Bush, who was the owner of the Bush Hawley House. And his, after he died, he had a probate inventory, which happens a lot. And in the inventory, you can see here between the hams and cheeks and dried beef, he has patients worth $7, Phyllis worth $50, and a Negro man named Cole worth $125. And then next you see listed animals and livestock. So if you didn't think that these enslaved people were part of the property, then here it is. And this is something when the kids see it, that kind of hits them, knocks them back on their heels. It's like, why would you list a human being next to the oxen? Well, it's oftentimes where humans are listed if they're enslaved. And if you wondered what this guy was doing for a living, notice right here, he has a sloop. So, and if you go to the Bush Hawley House, it is right under Route 95, right where Coscob, right where the bay is, or right where the cove is. So he was filling the vessel. He was a miller. He had lots of different things. And they've been telling the story about how David Bush was this great entrepreneur and how he was able to accumulate wealth which was true, but now we're realizing he had 15 enslaved people that were helping him along the way, or making sure that he accumulated wealth. So he did accumulate wealth by exporting people, and they're beginning to tell a different story now. We have 3 witness stones memorials now placed at the Bush Hawley House, and they're beginning to change their interpretation, which is wonderful for us because that's what we're looking for. We're not looking to tear down the Bush Hawley House. We're looking to tell a different story. Okay. Other places you find records. Well, here is on the left side is the East Haven Congregational Church. East Haven in those days also included Morris Cove and parts of Fairhaven and stuff like that. So it was a bigger town back before 1880. But I have a little cheat. If you go to the church records, this is the church record index that you can find at the state library and also on Ancestry. If you cheat, you can go to the back, and where it says no surnames, people without last names, you find lists many times of people who were enslaved. So we have here, you know, Pink married Stepna, and it says servants of Captain Morris and Isaac Forbes. You know, if you go down there, you have Morris Cove, Forbes Avenue, and you start looking at the names, you're like, oh, these are Hemingway, these are all the names of the streets in East Haven. And that's not a coincidence. You see Stephen and John, Rose Negro, her child, died 1783, about 5 years old. Another child of hers died about 2 years old. Sybil married Cork, servants of Jehiel Forbes. And this is alphabetical, so there's pages. This is probably about 4 or 5 pages of enslaved people just in East Haven that we can list here. And sometimes we have enslaved people listed, but they don't even give their names. It's like a Negro girl of Jaden Chitsey, a Negro woman of Lieutenant Bradley, a Negro girl of Deacon Smith. Well, if you know who Deacon Smith is, you probably know the name of his servants or enslaved people. So part of it is we see that it's not always something that people took the time to do. And over on the right here, sometimes, especially in Greenwich, I find the enslaved people took on the last names of the enslavers. So if you're looking for enslaved people owned by David Bush, look under Bush. And you see Cull Jr., Millie Patience, Lucy, Nancy, Hester, and Candace. So these are all names of enslaved people who were owned by the Bush family. And when they gained their freedom, in most cases, they took on the Bush name, although Hester took on the Meade name, and Meade is another big name in Greenwich. I think it was the name of the guy who put together that booklet. But it also, but we're not sure why she took on that last name, but there might have been a reason for it at the time. She went from place to place, and one of the schools that did her story, Greenwich Academy, the founder of Greenwich Academy took on Hester as a servant after she was freed. So it was interesting for the students to look at her life and where she was. And there's even an extant painting that Hester made that hangs at Greenwich Academy. So it's a kind of a neat thing. The kids could feel and see the relationship by where they go to school. We have other records, of course. This is the 1774 colonial census. We can see if you subtract out, the top one is Branford. If you subtract out the 4 indigenous people, and I think I did the math wrong, there's 99 Africans or people of African descent or Black, what they call Black people. Blacks in 1774 in Branford, that includes 1 Branford. We believe the majority in 1774 of these people were enslaved. So there was about 100 enslaved people. You take a snapshot of Branford in 1774, you find about 100 enslaved people, which is kind of. You can see the other communities, Guilford, which was Guilford and Madison, says 84 here, but Guilford, for some reason, had a larger group of indigenous people. They believe around the Westlake area, you know, right on the Guilford, North Branford border, Westlake, that there was a mixed tribal village there around this time period of Mohegans, Atlantics, and Quinnipiacs. Wallingford is large, but Wallingford included Cheshire and parts of Meriden today. Of course, New Haven. If you look who's missing, New Haven, East Haven, and West Haven, and parts of Hamden, you see 273 with only, that number, only 11 people, right? Only 11 were indigenous. So you can see the numbers. So in New Haven County at the time, which included Durham, there was about 1,000 or 900 people of African descent. We believe the majority of them were enslaved. The number held at about 3% of the population. And 3% sounds like a little amount, but that's kind of 1 in 30. So if I go to Guilford Public Schools today or Madison Public Schools today, there is not 1 in 30 African Americans. You might have, when I taught for over 20 years, I probably taught more kids whose parents were West Indian or African than I taught African American kids. So you can see the numbers don't make sense today. We'll continue. And this is in 1782, and I went through the numbers for 1782. And if you look there, you can see it's by county. At the time, New London County by far was the largest county of enslaved people. And I'm finding towns that I'm kind of, I don't know what the right word is, surprised at. It's like Lebanon and Colchester and places like up and out of away from water and away from the coast are these towns that had these larger plantations. Salem had, I think, the largest plantation, Salem, Connecticut, which is kind of north of Lyme in Connecticut. So there's places, because of the type of work that was being done, probably more like Rhode Island, you had more larger groups of enslaved people. Here, when we started seeing in the census data, in 1790, our census allows us to see what households enslaved people are in. In most cases here and throughout New England, except for these pockets in southern Rhode Island, oftentimes it's 1 or 2 enslaved people in a household. So you don't, occasionally you see families, and oftentimes they're associated with like ministers and people who just kept families. And one of the things we talk about is say, well, slavery was not as bad in the South, but here enslaved people were separated from potential mates and potential partners. They were separated here, and they were living in Puritan households. So that's even, if that's not worse there. But so you see that happening here. And we also see, and I'm not a demographer, but you can see like the fertility rate here seems to be very low among people of color. So as the population in Guilford and Madison doubled from 1790 to 1850, the Black native population shrunk in half. And that's not even biology. There's something else going on. So these are the names. I found this was from that Hartford Current, but it's also, you can find it if you scrape the census. These are the names of the enslavers in 1790 in Branford. We know some of them are North Branford. We know that, but I don't know. Maybe one of you knows kind of in your head where the census splits. But I just look at some of the names that I recognize, like Barker, Atwater, Russell, Samuel Russell is probably related to the Samuel Russell who helped found Yale University. Beach is certainly a big name. Hoadley, Rose, we still have Rose Farms, and Page and Rogers. The Rogers house, is there more than one of those? I know there's one in Stony Creek. And Noyce and Fowler, and Guilford, the Fowler family. And you might know Lindsley and others that you might know. But these are folks, we have a similar list in Guilford and many of the other towns. Usually the most affluent people, oftentimes the ministers. And I would say that the ministers, if they're tending to their human flock, they needed somebody else to tend to their real flock, their farm. Ship's captains, if they were away, they needed someone to do the work. There wasn't a lot, we don't have a lot of records of indentured servants and those types of people here. So it was oftentimes family, and if you could afford it, you'd hire an enslaved, or you'd take on an enslaved person. This is just straight out of the census. This is what the census looks like. If you go on Ancestry, there's probably a copy of the census here at the library that's printed out. But if you go there, this is the last page for Branford. We could see in 1790, there were 54 enslaved people and 36 free blacks. If you add those two numbers up together, you come very close to the 1774 number, don't you? So that brings us to 90. All right. And that brings us to 90, and there was 100 people of color. So we have 90 people, and we see these numbers start to flip. So the 1790 census after the American Revolution, we know there was a bunch of men who were freed to fight in the Revolution. There was a state law that allowed someone to free their enslaved person so they could, in a sense, take their place and fight in the war. And then we see, and then 1792, after the census, the law that says if an enslaved person is between 25 and 45 and they pass a physical and they want to be freed, the enslaver can free them and not be responsible for them in their old age. Now, we say today, like, 60 is a new 50 or 70 is a new 60. Well, I think in those days, 45 was the new 65. So was the old 65. So somebody who's been working really, really, really hard till they're 45, getting freed with nothing except the clothes on their back wasn't necessarily the biggest gift you could give somebody. But we know some enslaved people took great advantage of that when they gained their freedom and did some wonderful things. But we have to realize, and it happens even today, where undocumented folks, work as gardeners and maids and nannies and stuff like that. And then when they get older, they're released and they don't, they're not eligible for Social Security. So it isn't like today we're good and the people in the old days were bad. It just, there was a tendency in the state of Connecticut, and the local towns were so, they were tight with their money. So they wanted to make sure that somebody was responsible for that person. So that's why you couldn't just free somebody, and you couldn't free your 65-year-old enslaved person. You could free them, but then you had to oftentimes put something like a bond out there to make sure that they were taken care of in their old age. But freeing somebody is, in a sense, taking away the place where they live, taking their job away. And in a community where being free and black wasn't necessarily an advantageous thing to do, because as we see in the censuses, as the African-American population shrinks, I've had people argue with me, it's because there were no jobs here. Well, guess what's happening? Irish people are coming to take those jobs. So in many ways, it was probably cheaper to hire an Irishman as a day laborer or a gig employee than it was to keep an enslaved person for 12 months a year. So there was an economic piece to it, but there didn't seem to be a lot of heart associated with the decisions that were being made. This is some stuff specific to Branford. Jane Peterson Boley, is she here? She's not here today. But she, she's a town historian. She's done fantastic work I think upstairs or wherever the local history stuff is. There's this book filled with facts about enslaved people that she did in 2000. She finished in 2018. It's more of a folder, not a folder, but it's fantastic. It's filled with information. If anyone wants to further research enslaved people in Branford, she gives you a running head start. This is a photograph taken in 1998, supposedly of a slave. Now, the question is, how could you have a picture of an enslaved person in 1898? And I did the math one time and I figured it out, but the rule was in Connecticut, and it also depends how you define an enslaved person. The rule was in Connecticut, after March of 1784, if you were born to an enslaved woman, you only remained enslaved until you were 25 years old. And that later on became 21 years old. So there was a rule saying, but if you kind of do the math and you take a child born in 1783, who was able to have a child in the 1820s, and that person could be enslaved for the first 2 decades of our life. So this woman may not have been a slave for life, but she may have been enslaved at some part of her life. And some people say that, well, that's a bound person. That person's not a slave, but if you can buy and sell somebody, in my book, you're kind of a slave. So this was an enslaved person. And I think it's a great picture. It shows a woman with character, maybe wearing, many layers of clothing, and it isn't, and I'm not going to vouch for it. I just found it in Jane's book, and there's another book in Branford. I think it was the old like Shoreline book that came out in 1976. I think that. But these are some examples. So she had, this is the page of C. So you have Candace, Caroline, Casper, Kate, Catherine, Kathy, Cato, Caesar, Champy, and Child. This is from the 1800 census, just to show you what's going on. Down here we have Isaac Foote, and he has 2 enslaved people. Right here, it's the far right column. Over here we have Gaskill Woodward, and he has 1 enslaved person in his household. But what I liked on this one, because this page is Branford, but I think I'll bet you that it's North Branford, is we have Gad Asher. In Gad Asher, we have his story. Reverend Jeremiah Asher, Gad Asher's grandson, wrote his own kind of story, and in it, he wrote the story of his father from when he was captured in Africa to when he was brought off of a vessel in Guilford and fought in the American Revolution for his enslaver, who was either Linus or Titus Bishop, with the promise of his freedom when he returned. Gad Asher returned. Mr. Bishop said, well, I'm going to give you your freedom, but now you have to pay me what I paid you 35 years ago. And Gad Asher was double confused because he was married to a free woman, but he thought his children were enslaved, so he wanted to get his freedom to free his children. Well, the way the rules were, which I think was a Virginia rule that we applied up here, that the children's status went with the mother. So if the mother was free, even no matter what the status of the father. So he ended up paying for his freedom and then moving his family to North Branford. Jeremiah, his grandson, was very bright, ended up becoming a Presbyterian minister, wrote this autobiography, and then he ended up, and I think he was born in North Branford, he was the first African-American chaplain to die in service to his country. So that's Jeremiah Asher from like here, from right around here. So, and that, to me, that's like a pretty amazing story that the grandson of enslaved people died in service to his country in the American Civil War. And that's, and these are the stories we want to have the kids tell, but we want to tell and retell. There's a grandson of enslaved people in Guilford who died in Africa looking for homes for freed slaves in January 1861. He died in Africa looking for homes for freed slaves. It's like, that's another minister who came from nothing and ended up becoming a minister and then running a church in New Jersey. If you look at his name is Elymas Rogers, and his story is amazing too. So we have these stories that are kind of sitting here waiting to be told, and my goal is to do it with the kids, have the kids tell the stories, and that's really effective. There's some other places to find information. This is the Book of Negroes. So the Book of Negroes is if you're Canadian, you might have heard of this before, but at the end of the American Revolution, Sir Guy Carleton, you can see his name there, he put vessels together and shipped up African Americans who fought on the British side, runaway blacks who ran to the British, other free blacks, and sometimes even enslaved people. And he brought them to Canada because the British promised the African Americans that if you leave slavery, if you leave the Americans and come to us, we'll give you your freedom. Now, we tend to celebrate African Americans who fought on the side of the American side of the American Revolution. But if you're thinking about human beings, well, these guys fighting on the British side are pretty cool too, because they fought for their freedom, didn't they? So so we see these ships, and in it we can see these long lists of African Americans who came from the 13 colonies in the United States and were brought to Canada, and many of who still, their descendants still live there today. So it's just another side piece, but the closest I could find to here is New Haven and Killingsworth, or Killingworth. They put an S in there. But it's a great source of information. So if slavery was critical to the development of our country, and if slavery shaped the beliefs about race in our country, if slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, and if the enslaved resisted their bonds and still contributed to the growth of our country, how can we remember and restore the history of the enslaved. So that's kind of like our critical question for the Witness Stones Project. If these are all true, then what, how can we do what we need to do? And again, we were inspired by the Stolpersteine Project. This is a Stolpersteine right here. And for those of you who can read German, which I can't, but sometimes German looks close, but it says Max Schwerner, born in 1877, deported in 1942 to Theresienstadt, which was and then in 1944, he went to Auschwitz where he was murdered. So that's what that stone says. And that was our inspiration. There are 70,000 of these stones in Central Europe, across Europe, many in Germany, where it started in Berlin. But our project is to inspire. We're inspired by the Stolpersteine Project. We research enslavement, engage the citizenry, and educate the students. So that's what we're aiming to do. And so this is our mission statement, which is very similar to research, education, civic engagement. Witness Stones Project seeks to restore the history and honor the humanity of enslaved individuals who help build our communities. So it's a simple mission statement, and for me, it keeps us on track. If you have the Guilford the Branford Historical Society has a mission statement, but the mission statement has to keep you on track. What are you doing? What am I doing today? What am I doing today to further the mission? What should I not be doing to further the mission? So I just had a reporter, email me and said, "Oh, we want to do an article about X and Y and Z," and I'm like, here's somebody else to speak with, because that's not what we're aiming to do. We're aiming to do something else. If you're looking to see about politics, we're not doing politics. This is what we're doing, because if we get too deep in politics, then we're not going to be welcome in the schools. So our goal is to do what we're doing and do it well, and to be welcomed by everybody. We want everybody to want to be interested in what we're doing. So when my friend told me about the Stolpersteine Project, and I had to figure out how to bring, because I had lots of research. And how do I bring it to the students? And what happened is I probably had about 10 years of research. So I looked at it one more time with the idea of memorializing enslaved people, and I came up with these 5 themes. The themes are dehumanization, or enslaved as property, the treatment of enslaved, which is kind of a subset of dehumanization, but we keep telling the myth that slavery was okay here, it wasn't bad, so we have to kind of change that. Paternalism, and that paternalism is something kids completely understand, but Indigenous people understand, and African Americans understand. It's like, we'll vote for you, we'll do this for you. You don't, we'll take care of you, or we'll make decisions for you because we think we know what's best for you. Well, imagine that if you're an adult and someone's making decisions for you. That's the tough thing. So we see paternalism throughout enslavement and even for free blacks. In Connecticut, after the majority of African Americans were freed in 1818, we took away their right to vote. And they didn't get it back until the 15th Amendment. They didn't get it back. They got it back the same year that the African Americans in Alabama got it back. So that's what happened in Connecticut. Because why do they need to vote? We can take care of that for them. Economics of slavery. If you ever studied economics, it ruins any other thing you're doing, because it becomes about the numbers. When you start looking at the numbers, you realize so many decisions. When am I going to free that enslaved person? Not when my heart tells me to, but when my pocketbook does. And that's what we see throughout. And then the most important, which was shared to me by Marcus Shapiro from the Anti-Defamation League, is agency and resistance. If we keep telling the stories of victimization, then we're, in a sense, re-victimizing the enslaved people we're telling the stories of. So what we do is look at these documents and we extract out where the enslaved person is no longer involved with paternalism, but they're making their own decision and they're getting their freedom. And we try not to be judgmental. If you get your freedom for doing everything you're supposed to do and being loyal, then God bless you. If you get your freedom by running away, God bless you. If you get your freedom by poisoning your enslaver, God bless you. So it's just like if you get your freedom by fighting on the side of the Americans, that's agency. If you get your freedom by fighting on the side of the British, that's agency and resistance. Those are all ways that we can identify and help the students identify enslaved people not as an object, but as somebody that has similar thoughts and feelings and desires that they have. So this is how we do it. And if you're a teacher, you know what a jigsaw activity is, but we have the kids look at, a group of kids will look at dehumanization, another group will look at paternalism, another group will look at human agency and resistance, using primary documents, share them back with each other, so then at the end of this first unit, the kids see the big picture. They see what slavery looked like by looking at all these pieces. So that's our curriculum, and that's what we bring. We've worked with 5th grade through 12th grade students now. Kind of our sweet spots in middle school, but we can adjust. Upper middle school, I should say. You know, these are some of the documents in Suffield. We did the story of Tamar, and she was bought and sold a few times. She ended up getting her freedom by marrying Venture Smith's son. So Venture Smith is probably the most famous enslaved person in Connecticut. And his narrative is one of the things that I use to tell kids, slavery might have been gentle, but this is what Venture Smith says. He was hogtied and beat. And this is what happened to his wife. And this is how many times he was double crossed. But anyway, so the funny thing with Tamar is that we kind of, and we ended up having to redo her stone because we couldn't, she disappeared in 1810. So we thought she died then. Well, somebody else continued doing research because she lived in Suffield and she lived in East Haddam, and then they found her in Middletown. And we found her because her husband, Solomon, who married her and gave her freedom, wrote a runaway notice for his wife. Not because she was enslaved, but because she was a wife and she ran away from him. So he wrote a runaway notice. So at the end, I said, well, she showed her agency twice, once getting married and once running away from her husband. And it's a great story. And now we have the date changed because we found other records, I think 1817 or something like that. But these are the things that we try to do and it's hard because the folks in the past who wanted to somewhat make excuses for themselves holding people in slavery don't always want to show you the positive side of enslaved persons. They don't want to show their agency. They don't want to show their abilities. They want to sometimes make them look foolish or like make them like, I had to do this because of the way they acted. And so it's almost like, you know, a relationship today, if you ask an abuser, why did you do this? Well, they weren't submissive enough, or they talked back to me, or whatever it happened to be. And you sit there and say, gee, that's, for a person in power to say that is very different than looking at it from the person who wasn't in power. So as told by white owners, slavery was lenient with many freedoms, paternalistic with masters guiding the morals of slaves, treatment as part of the family, care for life. According to slave narratives by Venture Smith, James Morris, and Jeffrey Brace, and the story of Gad Asher by his grandson, whippings and beatings and hog tyings, double crossings and cheatings, abandonment of the aged and youth sold south, severe punishments for minor crimes. Some of the things that we're looking at today with how people are treated, and you're saying, why does someone die because they got stopped because they have a tail light out or something like that? But it's you seeing that thing, it starts in the 1720s and 1730s. It starts here where someone out of line, you know, that past curfew, the severe punishments for things like being past curfew for a person of color makes you begin to believe that our system might have been created to treat people differently, or maybe even more clearly. You know, what is human agency? Human agency is how one displays desire to take control of their lives. Agency can come in the form of resistance. It can also be demonstrated through one's capacity to control their own circumstances. When I started using agency, people said, where did you get that word? I think it's from like sociology or psychology, where, you know, if someone, you know, if they're going to commit someone to the insane asylum, do they have agency? Can they make their own decisions? But we can see this middle piece is somebody, it was a runaway ad for Fairfield. So we can see there's hundreds of runaway ads throughout New England. We like runaway ads because sometimes they're the only place we know what people look like. Because they'll talk about what scars or tattoos, or if they have a broken finger, or how tall they are, how much they weighed. So these runaway ads are useful for us to begin to imagine what enslaved people look like. So examples of agency through resistance include refusing to work, sabotaging work, running away. Other forms of agency could be working hard or earning enough money to pay for your own freedom, gaining or purchasing one's freedom, having children, and sometimes even surviving captivity. And especially in some of the plantations in Mississippi, people will say, you know, God bless my ancestors because they survived, because I'm here today because somebody, you know, survived. And this is showing agency through past and present successes, just like my grandparents who didn't have an 8th grade education were happy when many of their grandchildren went to college. We have the story in Guilford. We have this great story because we have now 11 generations of the story of Pat Wilson Phineas, who's on the right here. It's really, she's the 9th generation, but she has grandkids. And her story is related to Moses, who was told to us by Lyman Beecher. And we've been able to trace the purchase of Montrose and Phyllis in Boston in 1727, all the way to present day. Pat Wilson Phineas's dad was a Tuskegee Airman. Her granddad went to college at the Hampton Institute. There's a king of slaves in her family. There's Elymas Rogers, who died in Africa as part of her family. There was a famous weather prophet in Guilford in the 1880s, who was part of her family, that people like, I don't know if he had a barometer in his brain or something, he could tell when storms were coming. And it's kind of well documented. But we have this great family, and she has been the state representative from Ashford, Connecticut. She was a commissioner of social services, and now she's the board chair of the Witness Stones Project. So we're excited because we're telling her story. We're telling her family story. And we continually invite her in to say, what do you think? Or am I saying this wrong or something? And she doesn't think she knows everything, but she can tell you when she feels something. Like Moses, it said that he remained a slave because he was king. So he was a local king of the slaves, which is a kind of a Southern New England thing. And what that kind of meant to me was he was, you know, the old saying, rather be a big fish in a small pond. So getting his freedom didn't necessarily get him benefit because he was kind of running the show. He was a factotum. He sent his enslaver's son to Yale. He paid for Amos Fowler's son, Johnny, to go to Yale. So this guy was pretty amazing as an enslaved person. And Pat initially said kind of, no, if he could afford to pay for his master's son to go to Yale, he could have afforded to he could have paid for his own freedom. But, you know, after a while, she kind of said, well, yeah, but what was freedom to Moses? What was freedom to Moses in Guilford and things like that? But anyway, but I go to her to say, is this something I should say? So now when I tell the story, I say, well, this is what I think. I think he liked what he was doing and almost maybe a little Stockholm syndrome. But on the flip side, I said, but Pat doesn't agree with me. So it's good for both of our points of view to get across. So what do I do for a living? I do teacher, you know, on a good day, I'm doing teacher workshops. We're in all across the state of Connecticut, also in New Jersey, and working with historic Deerfield. And we do the research for individual communities. So if I were to come to Branford, I would take materials and analyze them and process them to make them accessible to kids in Branford. If I'm in Killingly, I'm doing it there. If I'm in Greenwich, I'm doing the stories there. I partner with historical organizations, house museums, all across the state. Churches, the congregational churches especially, right now are pushing, although the Episcopal churches are also pushing to look at their, using the other word, complicity towards slavery. How were they involved in the past? What can they do today to redress some of those issues? So we go from town to town. This is the stone on the bottom here is in front of St. George Church. Not because the Catholics at that church were. We know the Jesuits were at Georgetown, but 2 houses before St. George's was where Thomas Pynchon lived, and he held Joachim there in captivity, although Joachim was brought to Guilford by a Nicholas Loisel, who was a West Indies French refugee, was running away from the slave uprisings in Guadeloupe. So he brought 2 of his enslaved people to Guilford, and Joachim was one of them. So it's really interesting. And the part of the records we found that the French consulate records that were transcribed into the New London property records. So these pieces are all here, and the pieces, and I'm finding that enslaved people and free blacks, I kept thinking they were like, it's like I'm looking for them in one place, but just like everyone else, they moved around. So you hear stories of enslaved people from Connecticut getting their freedom and moving to Vermont, or people from Connecticut moving with their enslaved people. So all of a sudden there's this Vermont, Connecticut connection for African Americans that we're trying to put together. You know, with historical organizations, where using that sense of place, putting a stone where somebody lived, worked, or prayed is very, very powerful. It's not, slavery wasn't somewhere else that happened to someone else. This is slavery here happened to this person right here. The Moses stone is in front of the town hall because that's where Reverend Amy's father lived. So it's when you're standing outside the town hall, you're standing outside the place where Moses was held in captivity. That is much more powerful than reading about it in a book. You know, where are we at now? This is our updated map of Connecticut, and we probably have about 3 or 4 more places to fill in within the next week. But we've been doing a lot of work east of the Connecticut River recently. We just got a new project in Essex, Deep River in Chester. Of course, we're in Lyme and Old Lyme. Here, it's kind of the NFA, Norwich Free Academy, takes a lot of towns. So some of these are like regional schools, but we're working with Salisbury School, and we place the independent school there. We place a stone in Norfolk, Connecticut. We just got a contract with a school in Danbury. We're with 2 independent schools in New Haven, but we're working with the Wallingford Historic Preservation Office to do a project with the Historic Society and then moving into the schools next. So we have a lot of places. We probably have been in more, before we said 20 communities, and I just updated it today, and we're closer to 30 communities now and 7,000 kids. But what we're looking to do is really try to make our curriculum accessible to everyone. And right now we have to charge. We survive off of fee for service, but we're going to be talking to the State Department of Education that if we're already in 20% of the communities, why maybe we're kind of like an NGO now and we're doing government's work for them, and maybe they can help support what we're doing. We can find a way to make it the jigsaw activity very affordable for all Connecticut students, but the other part is just too much work. We can't give putting a stone in the ground, the research required for each town. We can't give that away yet, but if we get good funding, we can. But because our goal isn't to make money, our goal is to reach more students and adults. And I say students, but if you reach 200 students, then you're reaching 400 adults and aunts and uncles, and it really has a positive thing. And this is a stone for Latouche that was put in Branford 2 years ago. And I was arguing with the kids. So it says, it's hard to see with this thing here, but it says, Latouche, mother and weaver, enslaved here, emancipated. She was emancipated twice, which is a Connecticut thing, because she was emancipated before the law came out in 1792, which would have indemnified her enslavers from being responsible for her old age. So they freed her a second time, so they could do the Pontius Pilate thing, wash their hands. But the kids were doing this. The kids were deciding what they wanted on the stone. So we have our criteria, but we're open. And I said, well, we know she inherited from Reverend Jonathan Todd spinning wheels in a loom. So we could put, spinner and weaver. And they said, well, we want to put mother. I said, mother is mother, but I want to put like her occupation. And I said, how about, weaver and mother? And they said, how about mother and weaver? And then I realized I had to shut up at that point because the kids have completely humanized her now. They were thinking of Latouche like they were thinking of their own mother. And, I got a home run and I was arguing with the ref, arguing with the umpire, I hit it out of the park and I'm arguing with them. That these kids now have humanized her so much that I couldn't, I was like, oh, I just need to stop talking now. But that's an example of how it can happen. You can see, students become consumers and producers of information literacy. They collaborate and communicate. They present their findings to the public. And then they build the foundation to discuss hard history and the path towards truth and reconciliation. So we need to, we need to begin that foundation. We don't have to do everything in 8th grade or 7th grade, but we can tell a different story than we were told, or we can have the kids tell the story themselves, because if they're holding the documents in their hand or on their laptop, then there's not a question in their mind what happened in the past. It's not, they don't have to overly interpret anything. It's right there. So what they're doing is filling in information, but it's information that helps them, understand our country's history. And it's something, I grew up in Massachusetts, and I love Massachusetts and all the stories that went there. And I remember walking on the trails of the Nipmuc Indians, and the Bay Path up there was where the path the Nipmucs took from like Albany to Boston and all these things. And I never knew anything about African Americans in that community. And this project is allowing kids here to begin to re-envision the past. Imagine they close their eyes and they think of colonial Branford, and it's a much more colorful place than we've been sharing with them. And it's a much more colorful place because they still aren't finding this in the textbooks, but they can tell us different story that's in the textbooks that's truer and helps them understand what's going on around them. And that's what we want to do. When the kids ask me, why do I got to learn this? We can say, this is why you have to learn this. You have to learn this. So if you want to understand today, you have to look at what happened in the past. And if we can do that, then we can begin to make a better future. And so this project allows us to do that. It's exciting for the kids to write their own histories. The teachers are wizards. They can just do things. Kids, if I told you how many poems we heard, because they wrote papers about the enslaved people, but then they wanted to share their feelings. And poetry allowed them to share their feeling. And this past year was so enlightening. And then in the middle of COVID, I still have people calling me up saying, can we take on this really hard task? Can we take on this new curriculum that we as teachers don't know anything about and move it forward? And so I'm gratified that and grateful that they continue to come to us and ask us to do that work. And thank you for inviting me here today. And any questions? Oh. Yes.